Greetings everybody, and welcome to the first video of this channel. I'm the Spirit Guy, and welcome to Spirit Guy Ed, where hopefully today I can be your spirit guide, give you some fuel for thought, answer some unfulfilled questions, further your understandings, or inspire you. This is the first video on this channel, and possibly the most crucial and most important, and we're jumping right into it, immediately addressing possibly the most difficult question: what is God? A very important question, as is the answer which provides the conceptual understanding and definition of God. And is a question that, as far as I've seen in the mainstream, either isn't answered or isn't answered satisfactorily. I've immediately started off on this topic because though it is the most difficult, I think it is the most important. And in order to understand the future videos that will be uploaded to this channel, you'll need to know this content as a baseline of knowledge. This question will be answered across a few videos, so this will be a series of videos, as I'm not just going to give you a low resolution or ambiguous answer to what God is. I'm going to give you a high resolution answer and explain what God is and how it functions. This is essentially the first video you need to watch in order to fully understand the rest. So if you're interested in knowing or discussing the answer to what is God, you're in the right place. Most importantly, before we get started, this is important to keep in mind. The main point to this channel and these videos is to encourage the discussion of ideas. These are my beliefs, views, ideas, and understandings. I hope they inspire you to deeper thinking and to discuss your ideas with others, and hopefully help you with your spiritual progress. Different opinions, ideas, and constructive criticism or opposition is welcome. Everybody is welcome to their opinions here. These ideas or knowledge are not new. They have been around and evolved throughout human history, nor are these of my own personal making. I've learnt most of them from others. So I'm not some special enlightened soul or prophet or anything like that. I'm just someone that has been educated on these matters, a pupil who has a great teacher, or many great teachers. So with that out the way, let's begin. Now, if you do a quick search on the word God to try to get a definition of it, you basically end up with three definitions. Starting from God with a capital G as the creator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. Then the second definition is God with a lowercase g as a superhuman being or spirit worshipped as having power over nature or human fortunes, or a deity. And the third definition of God, with an even lowercase g, if that's even possible, as a greatly admired or influential person. But how far does this get most people? These are extremely low resolution and open to all kinds of problems. So a dictionary definition of God is not satisfactory to most people and doesn't provide a solid understanding. And ignorance, meaning no understanding or extreme misunderstanding of God, has led to many, if not all, the unnecessary problems and sufferings humanity has faced. And what I exactly mean by that, or the context of that statement, should be fairly clear by the end of this video series. Now, here is highlighted some of the types of problems we are faced with regards to the issue of what is God. Sometimes even terrible issues we come across with regards to this topic, the issue of what is God specifically. But in a nutshell, really these are the types of issues people are faced with ideas in general. It doesn't really matter which idea. A following behind it can be corrupted and can potentially turn out bad. If people are out looking for division, especially bad if it's because they're angry and hateful, they will find it. They will use biological differences. If they can't use that, they'll use religion. If they can't use that, they'll use culture. If they can't use that, they'll use location, where you're from. If they can't use that, they'll use family names. If they can't use that, they'll use politics, and so on. If people are out looking to make an us and them out of dubious intent to dehumanize the out-group, they will find it. And all these types of issues highlighted on this page, in most cases, stems from ignorance, which is the root cause of all evil, by the way. A full understanding of God solves all these problems associated with these issues. in more ways than one, because a full understanding and realization of God removes spiritual ignorance and makes one compassionate and wise. So, on this list, first up are the atheists, agnostics, or skeptics. They fit under one of three positions on God. The first position are people that all out reject that there is a God. They are convinced or are certain that there isn't a God. The second position are those that say they don't know if in fact there is a God, but are more convinced that there isn't one. And the third position are those that sit on the fence and they don't know if God does or doesn't exist. They're undecided or can't decide. There is also another position that people hold that can be applied to believers and non-believers as well. And they will say things like, well, that depends on what you mean by God. Meaning, tell me or elaborate your understanding of God to me and I'll tell you whether or not I believe in that or if I think you're accurate. And in efforts to convince people that there is or isn't a God, or who's correct, or to get different opinions out to the public, we put these people with different views together in places like on television programs or podcasts or venues where they can discuss or debate. Though I must say of these options, I do prefer podcasts because the television situation can be 6 people in a 45-minute slot all trying to have at it because there's no time. And a narrative can be pushed, or worse, the video itself edited. Debates also can be too time restricted and can turn into an unguided mess. Whereas podcasts are usually max a few people. They can talk for a few hours if need be and across multiple episodes. I found you really get the best understanding of someone from a podcast type discussion rather than any of these other forms of media. So we create these scenarios where, for example, you have a believer and a non-believer discussing the topic of God. Whether or not the believers chosen to represent their position even have a good understanding of God is another matter entirely. And that can be a real problem, since in most cases, other than the atheist that is fully convinced that there is a God, the onus falls on the believers to convince or guide the non-believers in their misunderstandings. And sometimes even an audience is involved or used in these debates or discussions. But what really ticks me off every time I've seen this sort of thing is they just jump right into it when they haven't even done the first and most crucial step. Define what God is. We have to establish that before we can argue whether it does or does not exist or the topics surrounding it. If to one person the word God means a man in the clouds, and to another it means the force of the universe, and we just jump into debating it, it's about as good as, take, for example, just take the word pillow, and the word only, and imagine that the word pillow to someone you're talking to them means knife, yet they use the word pillow. You're both using the same word, but its definition, meaning, and what it's referring to is different. So, having a discussion about pillows is going to take some time just to get off the ground with a person like this. You're going to have to check each other's definitions or meanings of the word pillow. If we haven't come to an agreed definition of God, then this is what the discussion or debate should be before the debate of whether or not it exists even takes place. You could even set up debates and discussions between definitions of God. You know, the question of what is God and defining it could potentially split everyone participating in these kinds of discussions because they don't all have or agree upon the same definition of God. And that's what we're here to discuss today. What is God and how does it work? Let's at least get the concept and the definition and understanding right. The second type of issue we are faced with regards to this topic is between followers of different or seemingly different religions. Particularly fanatical extremists and fundamentalists fall under this category. What I'll say to anyone who follows any of the world's major religious traditions is if you think your religion is telling you to do anything other than to put God, or perfect love, or perfect compassion with wisdom, at the very top of your value hierarchy, or within your own heart, and to put your ego beneath it, so treating everyone, regardless of how they act or what they do, as if they are God, for in fact, they are. If you think your religion is telling you to do anything other than to first and foremost practice loving kindness and non-violence or non-harm, then you do not understand your own religion, or your religion is false. And additionally, and this will make more sense as we go through these videos and others, if you think any of the world's major religious traditions are fundamentally different, you're either not understanding those religions or are misunderstanding them, or you could even be misinterpreting your own religion. Correct interpretation and understanding are crucial to seeing the fundamental sameness and unity of all major religious traditions and what they are all trying to say, describe, and teach. Which brings us directly to the next topic of the issues we face with regards to this topic of God. If division between religion isn't enough, we have division within the same religion or established belief system. For example, some people aren't just Christian. They have to go a step further. They are either Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Lutheran, Jehovah's Witnesses, or Orthodox, so on and so forth. Every major religious tradition has these types of schools or divisions. Why? Because they don't universally agree on the interpretation of their scripture and what it says and means. Or they don't agree upon a historical event or something of that nature. Though correct interpretation is crucial, what I said earlier still applies and is even more crucial than the interpretations of things of this nature. None of these types of problems or issues would occur with a full understanding of God. And that's what these videos and this series of videos is here to hopefully help with. Understanding God. So, what is God? For example, if you were to tell me that God is a man up in the clouds, I'd disagree. I'd say, you don't understand God. There are other vaguely phrased ideas of what is God. Is God a spirit? Is there one God or many? Though many people that understand multiple gods understand that there is the one, just all the lowercase g gods represent all the different aspects of that one God. Is God a human, a man, or a historical figure? Is God what you could call nature or force? All of these examples, I would say, are correct, depending on what you mean by that, depending on your understanding of what that means. Now, because we're discussing God and I'm discussing my view and understanding of God, I have to quickly, in low resolution, go over what I believe God is. And as you can see here are 3 words and their definitions. I could, of course, have added more, like, I don't know, limitless or all potentiality, for example, but I think these 3 about sum it up. I believe God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. Or simply, God is everything. You, me, every atom, every thought, every force, etc., etc., etc. I think you've got the basic idea. This can seem paradoxical, especially if your current understanding of God is too limited, but this hopefully will not be the case by the end of this whole video series. You know, for example, the God creating a rock so big he can't lift it conundrum. If this is you at the moment, watch this series until the end and then come back to these sorts of questions and you should by then understand their answers. Also, that God in its entirety cannot be put into any category. God cannot be understood simply on an intellectual level. God will always remain mysterious to some degree, for God is also evolving and changing. And this will hopefully make sense to you and what I mean by this by the end of this video. Now, the issue or thing with a position like this one is you can just use the word God as an answer for everything without knowing much at all about it. It's like saying to someone that's asking you what's 1 plus 1 and you responding, God! It's like, yeah, that's correct. That's the correct answer to everything, but that doesn't demonstrate to me that you know how to solve the equation of 1 plus 1, what each of those symbols mean or how they work. And this is what a lot of people are like with regards to God. They believe in it to some degree, but can't give satisfactory answers when asked about it. And hopefully that's not what I'll be doing here in these videos. The other possibility, if we again take the example of what does 1 plus 1 equal, some people can say 2 just because they know that's the right thing to say in response to that question or that sentence, but they themselves don't know how to work the calculations that arrived at that answer, because when you ask them another question like, what's 2 plus 2, they can't answer you. You know, things like E equals MC squared are like this. Lots of people, if you ask them what does E equal, or what's energy equal to, can reply, MC squared, because we've been told that in science, in school, and in science presentations, but how many actually know what that means? And again, hopefully there'll be none of this in these videos either. And finally, before we get right into it, I need to warn you that this series of videos explaining God are going to be rather on the dry side for some people. It's going to be very mechanical and procedural, I think could be the right words. Basically, how God works and functions and all its important parts. So this isn't really a sort of lovely, poetic and beautiful artistic way of describing God. It's more, this is this and that is that sort of style. Like, sciencey philosophy-esque. I would love for this to be some high-budget production with awesome effects and all the rest, but at the moment, I do not have the means to do that, so sorry. Definitions and concepts are vital to understanding these videos. In parts, I'll have definitions on the screen, there if you need them, but I won't be going through each of the semantics. I think if I do that, it can too easily distract from the complex concepts I'm trying to describe and explain here. So when needed, definitions will be on the screen to help, but I won't be reading each one out. As we go along, I'm going to try to be as step by step as possible. And so I will be repeating words and concepts as often as needed in order to understand newly presented concepts and how they relate to each other. So some people might be like, you could have done that faster, but others are not so quick to grasp these concepts, and I'm trying to cater to as many people as possible. And lastly, all diagrams or pictures presented are abstract representations, not literal representations. They're there to help visually represent these concepts to help you grasp them better. So let's do an overview of the key things we're going to be discussing in this series. Now, of course, God is the one and all, but to begin to describe and understand it, we need to start breaking down its aspects. And these three aspects, which I call mind, consciousness, and thought, are what create everything. So to be clear, these three aspects are in fact one. You can't separate one from the other and still have existence. And existence is actually a key word there, which will make sense later. And you'll also notice trinities or threes, three aspects to describe God or life, are commonly used across many religions and spiritual scriptures and symbols. Physical science has yet to discover the true fundamental components of energy, which is universal mind, consciousness, and thought. The three interacting components of the one force of all being, or God. When this is discovered, universal mind, consciousness, and thought, which is divine love, faith, and hope respectively, will be revealed to be the one theory for everything. Now, we're going to go through each of these aspects one at a time to describe and as best we can understand each of these aspects and what they are and how they work. So, if you need to pause the video here, go to the toilet, get something to drink or eat or whatever, do so now, because this stuff isn't easy. It's very deep and complex, and you'll have to be ready to really think in order to learn. Earlier, I gave you a low resolution understanding of God. Now I'm going to give you a high resolution one across multiple videos. So, let's begin. No, your screen hasn't broken. But where are we? Well, that is a very difficult question to answer here, because we're in mind. And mind is the most difficult aspect of God to understand. And more time will be spent on discussing mind than the other two aspects of God. Mind can be referred to by many different names or definitions, such as the ones I've listed here, such as the central or deepest part of God, God alone, meaning separate to everything else, divine love, the void, the first principle, the eternal principle, the eternal unchanging constant as it never changes or moves, the source of all life because it's where all life springs, the Father, the masculine principle, the unknowable God as you can't actually know mind, non-manifestation or nothingness, and literally nothingness. There's no information, no point of reference, no space or time, no matter, no movement, no sound, emptiness, or total peace, deep inner peace. And it can only be understood as a concept because you can't actually know it because there is nothing to know. But as much as it doesn't really make sense to say what it's made of or consists of because the answer is nothing, it has and is pure potential energy, which is another word for mind, as it does not exist. It's just potential, no form. And when it gets condensed and emitted, which is a process that we'll be explaining in the next video, its energy becomes active. So, mind consists of potential energy, which is actually nothing. It's just potential. But the void, or mind, you can say, is full of life. It's full of infinite life. All possibilities, all potentially existing simultaneously as infinite potentials. And at the same time, none. This is the aspect of God that you can refer to as omnipotent. So, back to the original question. What is God? Well, half of the answer is God is what is not. Now, mind is pure potentiality. Mind is therefore pure abstraction. Mind has no form, no boundaries, no limitations, and therefore no limits. Mind has no beginning and no end. It is eternal. Mind is the fathomless, motionless, silent, potential powerhouse of all power. Mind is the ultimate mystery. Mind is the eternal principle, and the eternal principle is the great mystery of life. The eternal principle is non-existence, and therefore non-expression, non-being, non-manifestation, non-knowing, and thus unknowable, the ultimate mystery. There's a good illustration of this in Zen Buddhism, in a discussion between master and pupil. The pupil says, "I don't know what the first principle is." And the master replies, "I don't know is the first principle." To elaborate, I don't know is God beyond creation and without creation. I don't know is God without consciousness, without awareness, and therefore without an I, without identity. I don't know is a formless state of non-existence. I don't know is God-less. There is no what and no who. But God is real. In fact, the mind of God is the only reality. Everything else is ultimately not real or is unreality. But this non-reality is what God manifests in order to reveal his reality. Without non-reality, God would not be able to expand his own consciousness, which we'll be discussing after this topic. So, through the mind which creates all illusion, reality grows. A way of thinking about this is, think of a dream. Is the dream a reality or an illusion? In a dream, do you not think and feel and experience? And yet you say that a dream is not real. What creates dreams? Mind. What gives dreams their sense of reality or non-reality? Mind. I don't know is non-being. Non-being is nothingness or emptiness. However, nothingness or emptiness is not dead, so to speak, because there is really no such thing as absolute death. Absolute death is the only impossibility, which is why the potential of existence as all possibility always exists. Nothingness or emptiness is oblivion, but oblivion is simply non-knowing or a formless state devoid of knowledge. Oblivion is forgetfulness, but is better explained as the absence of experience, which means that there is an absence of knowledge and therefore an absence of consciousness, and thus an absence of existence. Oblivion is an unregarded state because there is no I to regard it. Only consciousness can regard, and so only consciousness can be existent. It is important to remember that nothingness or emptiness is not death, but rather is the eternal and infinite potential for life. Life is the experience of existence. Emptiness is non-expression before expression. Expression is making known through information. Making known through information is consciousness, and consciousness is soul. No thingness or emptiness is impotent power. Power that is no place to go and nothing to do, because there is no such thing as a place, as there is no such thing as dimension. The eternal principle is limitless, without form, and thus without beginning or end, as it is purely uncreated power. Uncreated power is oblivious, which means unaware or unconscious. Uncreated power is unactivated, and therefore not in action. Dormant. Dormant means lying inactive as in sleep or sleeping. Or like a volcano, temporarily inactive. Or like in terms of plants, alive but not actively growing. Potential energy is the possibility of energy before it is activated and thus becomes active. Potential energy is energy that eternally awaits the possibility of being expressed. When potential energy is activated, it produces life, and life is the experience of the expression of potential energy's limitless potential to increase in its ability to become formed, and thus be informed, and thus express increasing degrees of information, and thus create increasing degrees of knowledge. The eternal principle is inexhaustible, limitless potential power, but without existence it is impotent. Power is energy. Potential energy is potential power. Potential power is impotent unless it creates or forms actual energy. Devoid of a state of existence or a state of being, the eternal principle is formless and thus powerless. The eternal principle does not know its power because no knowledge exists in pure potentiality, as no consciousness exists, no information. Knowledge and consciousness are forms of energy. Without knowledge or information, the eternal principle is changeless, and there is nothing to change as there is no form of energy, only potential energy. The formless non-state is referred to as the eternal principle, because it is not subject to any thingness, and so is not subject to change. The eternal principle is devoid of subjectivity, as it is devoid of consciousness. The eternal principle is absolute objectivity, in the sense that it is not subject to anything, which means any form of thing, including thought. The eternal principle is independent, as it is non-existence, non-being. There's a nice way of illustrating the eternal principle in a Buddhist quote. When you have understood the destruction of all that was made, you'll understand that which was not made. Now, I'll say this next part slowly, but even if you don't get it now, the next video goes right into this in depth rather than a single sentence, so it'll be easier to understand then. The eternal principle, as pure potentiality, has innate potential to know through the potential to create knowledge via the formless non-states uncreated or limitless possibility. The eternal principle's potential to know is the potential to create, and creative potential transfers impotent uncreative power into potent creative power. Knowledge can only be found in beingness or I-ness, which is consciousness. In order to express potential and thus become knowledgeable and knowable, the eternal principle of impotent power becomes omnipotent, all-powerful, through harnessing its limitless potential to create. Pure potentiality thus has the ability to be creatively intelligent. Through creative intelligence, pure potentiality can apprehend that it is possible to have the power to create, and through this creative power, know its power. Mind is pure potentiality, and is thus unformed and chaotic impulses of potential power or energy, existing nowhere, but with the capability of existing everywhere. The chaotic impulses of potential energy do not exist as any form of energy, but as potential force, which potentially can convert the chaotic impulses into a compulsion and give it the means to be activated. This process will be explained in the next video in depth. So, before the beginning of anything and everything, before being, God is divine mind, or pure potentiality. Divine mind is also divine love. God, divine mind, divine love are one and the same. Everything is created from divine love or mind, from pure potentiality. Pure divine mind is stateless, and so does not have any form of existence. It has no substance, it has no tangibility, no manifestation. Existence means the fact or condition of being or existing. Existence is a condition, but pure divine mind is unconditional, and that is why it is intangible, invisible. Pure divine mind is unconditional divine love, infinite, eternal, formless, and unchanging, the eternal principle, the creative potential source of life. Pure divine mind, or the non-manifest, is changeless because there is no existing condition, and so no change can occur in it. A condition is a form of limitation, and so has an inherent finiteness, a point of beginning and a point of end, and a process of change. But divine mind is without limits. Pure divine mind is beyond any state of existence, and before any state of existence, and after any state of existence. Pure divine mind is also known as absolute reality, or absolute truth. Pure divine mind is absolute unity, or absolute oneness, because there is no means of division, as there is no condition of existence. There is no dimension in pure divine mind. Pure divine mind is dimensionless. Non-manifestation is dimensionless and has no appearance, and so there is no state of relativity. Pure divine mind is without identity, which is the quality or condition of being a specified person or thing or individuality or personality. Mind is the impersonal aspect of God because pure mind has no ego. This is what is meant in Buddhism by no self or selflessness, which is the absence of consciousness. There is no I in pure mind because there is no separation. Separation can only occur when a condition is created. Only consciousness has a sense of self or an I because consciousness is a condition. Pure mind is conditionless and so objectless, and therefore also subjectless. Pure mind is stateless, and so it is absolutely still and silent. There is no movement or disturbance of any kind. The silent stillness or emptiness of pure divine mind is its statelessness, its lack of condition. Pure divine mind has been described as emptiness, darkness, the void. However, even though it is described as dark, empty, or a void, it is not devoid. The void, or emptiness, means lacking a state of condition and therefore lacking in any form of substance. However, pure mind, or divine love, is the essence of existence. Essence in this sense means the reality underlying a phenomenon or phenomena. Although pure mind lacks substance, lacks tangibility, lacks energy, and therefore lacks information, it has the ability to create it because it is the potential source which produces the essence of creation. The essence within and behind substance, which is potential energy. Pure mind, which is absolute reality because it is not dependent on any form of or substance, is the essence of life. Pure mind, the state of non-being, is a source of creation of being, the creation of substance, and is therefore the source of creation or of energy and thus information. Pure mind is uncreated. Creation can only occur when a condition occurs. Pure mind is conditionless and therefore uncreated. There is no beginning, no end, no movement, no form. Nothing can make pure mind because it lacks substance. It is purely abstract potentiality. In this sense, this aspect of God is eternal and unchanging as it is formless, but it potentially is all form and thus everything. The potential isness of pure mind is formless and therefore non-identifiable, but it still potentially is. In fact, it simply is potential isness. But potential is empty, which means lacking in substance, and therefore potential isness is non-relative. Pure mind is outside the conditions of space and time, but far more real because of this, as space and time are created conditions, and all condition has limitation. Reality in this sense means what underlies appearances, and there can be no appearance without substance or form, no appearance without condition. It is only appearance, and therefore only something conditional, that makes something perceptible, whether it be physical or non-physical. Pure mind is lacking in condition and so lacking in appearance and is therefore imperceptible. But consciousness, which is a condition created by the mind, is the window of mind, and consciousness is what is able to perceive so that something can be known. Pure mind is unknowable because it has no consciousness and therefore no access to information. Pure mind is lacking in actual energy and therefore lacking in information, and thus has no knowledge because there simply is nothing to know because nothing has happened. There is no substance and therefore no consciousness, no thought, no feeling. Pure divine mind is therefore absolute unawareness. This has been likened to the unconscious sleep, is what it's kind of like. Pure mind is unconscious potentiality, the unknowing. This concept may be difficult to grasp. Try to imagine having no awareness, no thought, no feeling, no sensation of any kind. And then forget about even trying to imagine this, and you might get a slight idea. However, this concept can be apprehended by the highest state of consciousness once we have spiritually evolved. Pure mind is without personality, without identity, without a self, and so is impersonal. Pure mind is non-being. It is only by being that something can become an entity. Being is a condition and so has dimension. Non-being is unconditional and so dimensionless. Pure divine mind is dimensionless. Non-being or non-existence is unknowable because it has no form. Nothing exists in pure mind, and yet, pure mind is the source that creates all existence. From the statelessness of non-existence, or the void, pre-existence emerges and then becomes existence. Pure divine mind has no energy. Statelessness means complete inertia. This is what is meant when God or mind is described as eternal, limitless, and unchanging. In creation stories in general, in the beginning there was emptiness or the void. Emptiness as an active state of being is filled with all possibilities. Emptiness as a non-active state is filled with no possibilities. How does mind go from non-active to active was explained briefly just before when I slowed down for you, but it will be explained in detail in the next video. God, or if you like, the supreme source of all energy, or the one most mighty, is the source of both active and non-active states of emptiness or nothingness. God as nothingness or non-manifestation is God in his separateness. And again, God in his state of nothingness or non-manifestation is absolutely infinite, for in this state there is no end to possibilities. God in this way will forever remain separate from his creation. God will exist without creation or manifestation. The mind of the supreme source of all energy is infinite. It did not begin, for it was not created. It was not manifested into becoming. Only things which are created can have a beginning. God did not create himself. Therefore, God has no beginning and will have no end. Now, for the limited consciousness of the human mind, this whole concept of mind is somewhat difficult for most to truly grasp and to fathom. However, be comforted by the fact that not one single being in creation can utterly fathom this great mystery. Not even, if you believe in them, the highest order of angels or the most enlightened souls. If they could, then God would no longer be the one most mighty. The closest way I know that we can all experience mind, so to say, it's not exact but similar, is in the type of non-thinking meditation, where you meditate on nothing, you stop all thoughts, you go completely still, you void your mind. The only other way I'm aware of is dreamless sleep. You wake up, but in a way, you can say you were nowhere, but it's not as though you're not there, so to say. Head spin, right? But that's what happens if you try to understand mind completely. God, from his state of nothingness or non-manifestation, although complete within self and infinite, is still capable of growth and development. The true meaning of perfection is to be in a state of constant possibility. It is a common misconception to think of perfection as a final ending to state. People in common phrase say that something is perfect when they can see no other possibility for improvement. This is because they have limited further possibilities through their own finite application of thought. And thought we will be discussing after consciousness. To state perfection as final ending means stagnation. Final ending means degeneration is the only possibility apart from stagnation. God is not finite in his thought. God is infinite in his thoughts, so therefore God's idea of perfection is to be in a state of greater possibility. God as perfection is always in a state of greater possibility. God's creation, which is the manifestation of life, is therefore also in a constant state of greater possibility. And this is why evolution is a perfect state of being, for evolution allows ever-growing greater possibilities. And because God's mind is infinite, so are the possibilities. The manifestations of this energy, which become consciousness, talked about later, are secondary to the source, and therefore are not the greater reality. God alone is the greater reality, and everything else is only relative to that. So therefore, everything else is relative reality, until the consciousness of that energy becomes reunited with the primary source of all energy, which is God. Pure mind is without personality, without identity, without a self, and so is impersonal. The word mind is often used synonymously with consciousness. However, technically, consciousness is the formation of mind, whereas mind itself has no form. When I speak of mind, I mean pure potential energy, pure potential power. Mind as mind alone, that is, without consciousness. Mind is without form, which means mind is not in a state of perceivable existence, whereas consciousness is form, the form of being, which means perceivably existing. When someone says, I can't make up my mind, they simply mean they can't decide between possibilities. However, deciding is a quality of consciousness and not a quality of mind, because mind itself is limitless possibility. Consciousness selects possibilities, and from these makes a choice. Once a choice is made, a person then says, I've made up my mind, which means they have made a choice in relation to possibility. There has been much debate for thousands of years around what is meant by mind and what is meant by consciousness, and this confusion has meant confusion in human beings' knowledge of God. Rather ironically, when the atheist declares that there is no such thing as God or that God does not exist, they are absolutely right, because God's aspect of pure mind does not exist. There can be no evidence of God's impersonality because mind is completely anonymous. It is the nameless name, which means it has no form, not even sound, and devoid of a sense of self, or is selfless. But because the atheist declares mind state of non-existence from a spiritually ignorant point of view, they are absolutely wrong. Because God's other aspect, as consciousness, does exist, as all that exists, and consciousness cannot exist without mind, which means the self cannot exist without the non-self. Which brings us to our next topic. Consciousness! The lights are on! The abstract stuff is kind of over. Consciousness, to sum it up simply, is the opposite of mind. The opposite to everything we just discussed. On screen are some of the words and definitions used to refer to and describe consciousness, such as manifestation, the created, the mother, the feminine principle, divine faith, spirit, being, existence, awareness, information, ever-changing, because it's never still, impermanence, the knowable God, finite, condition, limitation, the received or the receiver, reflective, chaotic, laws or rules, I am, meaning self-awareness, God's first words, or karma in action, cause, effect, action, reaction. The type of energy that comes in from that is consciousness is receptive energy or actual formed energy. It's gone through a process from potential to formed, and we'll be going through that process later. This is the aspect of God that you can refer to as omniscient. Basically, we've jumped from nothingness to something. What was nothingness before the something? Mind. What was now the something? Consciousness. Now, this is a very abstract and oversimplified demonstration of how things come to be. If you imagine the black circle represents the eternal infinite, no beginning, no end, but then you establish a point on the circle. Now you can make distinctions, points of reference, information. You now have consciousness. And the colors here are representative. Notice the point of distinction is blue. That's because thought and the process of thought is what gets or makes something from nothing. Thought will be the last topic we cover. At the moment, we're focusing on consciousness. God is life. Life is everything that exists. Therefore, God is all that is. God is both the negative and the positive aspects of life. God is mind. Mind is consciousness. Reality is perceived through the consciousness of mind. The higher the consciousness, the greater and higher the reality of mind. The greater and higher the reality of mind, the greater the ability to manifest the mind of God, which is the mind of all consciousness. God is all consciousness, and yet God is also the mind that is separate from all other consciousness. In this way, God is the only true reality, for God is separate from any other consciousness, while at the same time being all of consciousness. God's mind creates consciousness. Without God, there can be no consciousness of any kind. God's mind can exist separately from all of consciousness, but all other consciousness cannot exist separately from the mind of God. Seemingly paradoxical, the perfect rest of mind is the source of all energy, which is activity. And also seemingly paradoxical, it is the contrast between activity and non-activity which allows activity, which is consciousness, to become conscious of the perfect stillness of mind as pure potential energy and conscious of it as its source. The state of opposites allows each opposite to know of itself through perceptual comparison. When activity as consciousness perceives inactivity, which is mind, it perceives that there is a state that is opposite to it, an inactive state, and can thus discern it, distinguish it as being different to itself. Consciousness can therefore perceive the reality of mind through the awareness of an opposite state to its own, silence and stillness as opposed to sound and activity. The perfect rest of absolute inactivity, mind, the void, or nothingness, emptiness, etc., means that mind is dark without any light, as light is an effect which comes from activity. This puts a whole new twist on who's afraid of the dark, doesn't it? Mind or potential energy is not really dark, however, unless there is something to compare it with. Consciousness can only perceive mind as darkness due to mind's different in comparison with its active state. It is better therefore to say that mind or pure potentiality is devoid of visible light. Mind or non-existence or non-being is non-activity, and so is invisible compared to being or existence, which is visible because it is active. Invisible means unable to be perceived through visible light, and perception, which is an aspect of consciousness, is itself a form of spiritual light. We're not speaking of physical light here. For this reason, the eternal principle, pure mind as pure potentiality, will eternally remain invisible to consciousness. This means that mind as potential energy is non-polar, or neutral, as it has no form. Without form, there is no greater or lesser, and yet potential energy, or mind, equally causes both greater and lesser in its manifestations through the formation of energy. Time, or reference, begins once energy is formed as matter. Consciousness is formed mind energy, or spiritual matter. Once energy is formed, information is created. Once information is created, existence comes into being. Once existence comes into being, there is experience. In sacred writings, this reference through experience is called the Book of Life, or the Akashic Record, which is universal consciousness, the all that is since the creation of matter. Mind as potential energy is eternally now, without a point of reference, while consciousness as mind matter or actual formed or created energy refers to now or potential energy as its source and so forms a point of reference. By consciousness referring to now or directing back to the source of energy, which is mind, an experience is perceived, and experience is caused by the interactions of formed energy. Consciousness thus makes reference to the preceding and proceeding now experience caused by the interactions of formed energy. Consciousness therefore creates a sense of time or reference point through referring between one experience of now and another experience of now. Because consciousness is mind's awareness, it is aware of changes in formed energy and that change is constant. Consciousness therefore creates ongoing reference points between those changes, and so experience becomes previous, current, and future projected. In this sense, time is created as reference through experience. Fundamentally, however, there really is no such thing as time, only constant nowness. It is changes in matter that causes the perceived changes in now, and so a sense of change creates a sense of time. Without change, there can be no concept of time. Without formed energy, there can be no change. Formed energy creates a sense of time because it is constantly changing. Time is really just a reference point between each and every interrelated particle of energy so that each and every particle can make meaning through its reference to all other particles. Experience is the perception of changes in formed energy, both spiritual and physical. Mind and consciousness together as one create being. Being is existence, and existence can only occur through the formation of a state of awareness, which is consciousness. It is only when mind has formed consciousness by becoming aware of its own existence that a state of being is created. The intimate union between the mind and consciousness of God is the sacred marriage that creates and sustains all that exists. This is the highest form of love and is what divine love truly is. God is love. It is divine love which forms life itself in its vast myriad forms of existence. Love and life are therefore one. So, from the one source of mind comes consciousness. Thus the one becomes two, as active and receptive states, the divine or sacred masculine-feminine principle. This is an act of spiritual fission at the originating eternal source of all existence, but simultaneously a state of fusion is also produced, a marriage. The masculine principle as the active force or positive field is opposite to the feminine principle as the receptive force or negative field, but they are still of the one force. The one force has two modes. God's universal consciousness at the dimension of perfect unity and harmony of energy is the state of perfect peace. And so God's soul at its highest degree of manifestation or consciousness is at peace with itself, at rest. And it is from this state of rest or perfect peace that energy can then renew itself and re-emerge and reform continuously. Heaven is thus not a final end, but the source of eternal renewal. We've been over mind and consciousness, and now to the last topic of this video, the third aspect of God, thought. And just like the other aspects, here on screen are some of the words and definitions used to refer to thought, such as divine hope, the sun, energy, the former, the informer, the bringer of truth and light, the will of God, the creator of knowledge, the maker of laws and rules, intelligent design. Thought goes through a cyclical, constant process from mind to consciousness and back. We've gone over the nothing, or mind, and the something, or consciousness, but how do we get something from nothing? How does nothing become something exactly? What is the process? Thought is the aspect of God, or the process of its creation that makes something from nothing. Thought moves from or as pure potential energy or mind and transforms into formed energy or consciousness, and then returns and transforms back to potential energy or back to mind. When it emerges from mind, it is in an active state, and so it is active energy or masculine energy, which moves from potential energy into formed energy, transforming in stages along the way, becoming less and less like mind and more like consciousness. Consciousness receives this energy, which is thought, and transforms it completely into formed energy or consciousness or conscious thought, and reflects the energy or thought back to the mind. The reflected or returning or received thought energy is receptive energy or feminine energy, not to be confused with gender here. Now, this example is rather clumsy and very, very, very oversimplified, but it should do for now. To put this into some kind of a picture, think of your own mind, consciousness, and thought. Keyword there was think. When you think about something or try to remember something, you consciously focus your attention to the subject or object at hand. Your thoughts or thought energy moves from your consciousness as the intention or thought to better know the subject or objects, like remembering a memory or a piece of information. The thoughts go from your consciousness and go into your mind, where you're not directly aware of them or where they are or what they're doing. Not until the thought re-emerges or has changed and cycled back into your conscious awareness, or another way of saying this is, not until you are aware that the thought has changed do you notice it again when it has re-emerged or transformed into, hopefully, the desired answer or another piece of information. One way of putting this is, the thought went from your consciousness into your mind and retrieved or formed information on the subject matter you were thinking about. Or another way of putting this is, thought was transformed by mind and consciousness noticed or was aware of the change. I could rephrase this in many other different ways and add more information to it, but I think that would cause more confusion than assistance at this point, so I'll leave it here for now. So, thought energy goes from pure potential energy to formed energy, and it's a very complex process. that begins at a point of incomprehensible pure abstraction, which we can only understand as a concept at best, as this beginning point is mind, and becomes formed conscious energy. Here on screen is the process of thought, which is the process of creation laid out in brief summary, which we'll be going through step by step in the next videos. They will be long, as it takes considerable time to go through this process, explaining it each step of the way, especially thoroughly, so be ready. So the process of thought, or the process of creation, begins at the mind, which has no knowledge but limitless potential to form knowledge, which then becomes potential knowledge, which then becomes potential thought, which then becomes pre-thought, which then becomes pre-awareness. Then pre-awareness and pre-thought together return to the mind and transform into awareness of possibility to create knowledge, which then creates the creation of formed thought, which then creates actual awareness or consciousness, which then creates knowledge of thought, forming the concept of I through awareness, which then creates knowledge, I exist, which then creates self-consciousness, which then creates knowledge of existence. Also notice there are 13 stages in the process of thought. 13 is the mystical number of unity. You'll notice in religious texts, mythological stories, or other creative works of art, 13 commonly appears. For example, 12 disciples plus Jesus makes 13. As a literary example, the 13 dwarves in The Hobbit, this is what the stories and the characters in those stories, or the symbols of the stories, are representing. This is the process of being, which is to be aware of existence through consciousness, which we'll be explaining in the next video. And that's about it for today. If you have questions, hold off on asking them, as they'll most likely be answered by the end of this video series on what is God. In the next video, this process is what I'll be going through. How mind stirs from perfect still non-activity, or a non-active state with no possibilities, only potentiality, into an active wavy state filled with infinite possibilities. Or how we go from potentiality to possibility, which is part of the process of thought. We might get to number 6 in the process of thought, maybe. It depends on how long it ends up being, but the video after the next one will pick up on wherever has been left off. And like most video endings nowadays, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because I'm not able to upload these videos on regular basis or regular intervals. These take considerable time to prepare, and this is not my occupation, so I can't solely commit to making these videos. I can only commit to them in my spare time. And also share, and I don't just mean on your social media. Send a video link to other people or channels that might have interest in this. I'm particularly open to constructive criticism and opposing views. And also share amongst conversation with your friends, family, people you know, or your associated place of worship. Go out there and discuss ideas and listen to different opinions, and figure out for yourself what God is and what you believe. And so, until the next video, or should need for me arise and call to me again, go forth with peace and love and make the world a better place. Farewell, friends.